Horror fantasy, also known as dark fantasy, is a subgenre that blends elements of, well, you guessed it, both horror and fantasy. It incorporates disturbing and frightening themes within a fantasy setting. Some elements include magic, as seen in the 1996 movie The Craft, or mythical creatures, as seen in Gremlins, but with a twist of invoking fear and suspense with these additions. Ancient folklore has had a big influence throughout the centuries, which explains why vampires and werewolves are always in these types of stories. An essential part of this genre is the concentration of atmosphere, as there's more focus on world building than regular horror. This helps exude this supernatural aroma to the film, as horror fantasy has more of an emphasis to how it makes you feel as you watch it or read it. The genre has roots that go back as far as the 12th century, with such cautionary tales like The Witch of Berkeley by William of Malmesbury. Eventually, as the centuries progressed, the genre was impacted by the introduction of the Gothic novel, with Horace Walpole's 1764 The Castle of Otranto, marking an evolution of horror fantasy with the focusing of stories about characters' psychological issues in realistic, suspenseful settings. And because of this, the 19th century is where the subgenre cemented its place in history, with authors such as Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, and Mary Shelley using this foundation to continue the genre's maturing. Their works are what helped evolve the genre to its modern landscape that we know now. I truly believe that this genre has so much potential to be far greater than it already is. For whatever reason, I don't see a lot of movies made in this genre, and I'm not sure why, as the spectrum of ideas could be endless because of the addition of fantasy. Slashers and found footage has always seemed to be the most popular subgenre in Hollywood since the late 90s. For every one Nosferatu, there's 10 Saws. No shade on Saw, but it's the repetition that bores me. Other than the second installment, it's like deja vu every time a new one drops. Mind you, I'm comparing this franchise to a movie that has been retold since the early 1900s in Nosferatu, and it still manages to be more refreshing. Fantasy horror, since the days of the Brothers Grimm tales, has always been stories with a moral lesson. Horror is the best representation in modern media that uses its premise to be allegories or metaphors that have something to say about human fears, issues, or struggles, such as the Babadook, as its titular evil represents trauma that needs to be healed. Horror fantasy can be used to speak on such topics in ways that can be more creatively enticing and invigorating because of the potential that the genre has, since the fantasy element enhances the material. For example, Pan's Labyrinth's use of contrast with his imaginary otherworldly adventures as a way to escape the realities of human society represents an escape to the reality of human society, since the backdrop of the story is war. Horror can also be used to highlight maturity, such as in Ginger Snap's use of its werewolf counterpart as a metaphorical representation for her becoming a woman, since it's linked to her menstrual cycle. Quick side note: Alan Moore used the same idea, doing it first in his Swamp Thing run in issue 40, The Cursed, where a housewife turns into a werewolf during her period. As of recently, what inspired this video is the realization that Terrifier 2 is a horror fantasy. And for some reason, when I made that connection, that movie isn't what I would think of when I think of horror fantasy, as there's a lot of attention to violent set pieces. And that's really why a bunch of the audience goes to watch these movies. We want to watch Art the Clown kill its next victim in the more brutal and more horrific, more bloody ways. But there are elements that I would consider horror fantasy, and that is mainly due to the main character Sienna having access to a sword straight out of medieval fantasy stories, something that Lord of the Rings or King Arthur type story, a sword that could only hurt the villain. And also, Sienna is alluded to being a Valkyrie or an angel of some sort of type, the typical good versus evil story. Another movie that kind of squeaks his way into this category is Hellboy 2, as I see more of an action fantasy more than anything. But some of the sequences, especially the whole beginning and introduction of the villain and those creepy but cute little teeth-eating fairies, was honestly super unsettling and terrifying enough for me to say that it is a horror fantasy. I think the best representation of the possibilities of horror fantasy is the movie The Crow, because of its attention to atmosphere, gothic elements such as the titular crow, and since the main character is seeking revenge for the murder of his wife, he is always dealing with this grief, and it impacts the character's thoughts throughout the film. Classic gothic storytelling. Now, the aforementioned movies are some of my favorite horror fantasies, and I wish there to be more to add to my list. There's so many avenues you can take this subgenre and run with it. The possibilities are endless, and I'm really excited for the future. Maybe one day I'll add a movie that people consider a classic to this genre. I'm glad that to this day we are getting new additions, and it gives me hope for the future. I'm also ecstatic that there can be innovative inclusions like Terrifier 2 that mixes two things that shouldn't mesh well but end up working wonderfully with its compound of gore slasher with hints of biblical fantasy. I want to be in the forefront of asking Hollywood that we need more. So, like and subscribe. Better this production. Peace out.